Jung, Memories, Dreams, Reflections.
Welcome in. Ready to dive into the mind of Carl Jung.
Always ready for that. We're focusing on his autobiography this time, right?
Yeah,
Memories, Dreams, Reflections.
exactly. And, I was struck by how much his personal experiences seem to have really fueled his work.
Oh, absolutely. You can't separate the man from his ideas, you know what I mean? It's like his whole life was this journey of self-discovery that just happened to produce some incredibly insightful psychology along the way.
And that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating. It's less about Jung the therapist, more like we're getting this backstage pass to how his own life experiences fed into these huge psychological theories he developed. And one of those themes that pops out right away is the importance he puts on inner experience. Yeah, the outside world matters, but he's saying it's the connection to our inner world that gives those experiences real weight.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It's central to how he understands people. For Jung, it's not enough to just observe something happening externally. The real action is how that event resonates within someone. Their individual interpretation of it, the emotions it stirs up, the memories it might trigger, all that internal stuff. That's where the real meaning gets created, according to him.
It's like he's saying everyone's walking around with their own custom-made set of 3D glasses or something. Same world, but how we see it, how we experience it, that's totally unique to us.
Exactly. And to illustrate that, take Jung's own childhood. He talks about moving from the countryside to the city, and he doesn't describe it as just a simple change of scenery. For him, it was this huge clash between two completely different ways of seeing reality.
Which makes sense, right? You go from this world of nature, this quiet, almost spiritual environment he describes in his childhood, and suddenly you're thrown into the city. It's loud, it's crowded, it's all about the material world. Talk about a reality check.
Right. And it's easy to see how that kind of early experience, this collision of two such different ways of being, might have really shaped his thinking later on. It's like this early exposure to the power of perception, of how our surroundings can have this dramatic impact on our inner world. It's almost like a precursor to his later work on archetypes and the collective unconscious.
Like his own life was a living example of the theories he'd go on to develop. It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it.
Yeah.
But it wasn't just his environment shaping his thinking, right? Even as a kid, Jung had these, pretty unusual experiences, almost like glimpses into this path he'd eventually take.
Right.
We're talking dreams, visions. He wasn't just playing in the sandbox.
Oh, totally. And he talks about this one dream he had as a kid, super vivid, where he finds this throne room underground. Years later, while he's studying religion, he comes across similar imagery, almost like these early experiences were planting seeds or something.
Right, like these little breadcrumbs his subconscious was leaving for him to follow. And that's a biggie right there, the importance of dreams for Jung. This wasn't just your brain randomly firing off while you sleep. These held serious weight in his view.
Absolutely. Dreams were like this direct line to the unconscious mind, full of symbolism, messages, insights that could guide us if we just learned to interpret them.
Which I think is something that probably resonates with a lot of people, right? I mean, who hasn't woken up from a dream and been like, what in the world was that all about? Jung might say, pay attention, your unconscious is trying to tell you something. But he wasn't born with all the answers, was he? Even a mind like Jung's had to go through its own growing pains.
Oh, for sure. He talks about struggling in some areas, even having this real aversion to things like gymnastics when he was a kid. He just couldn't get into it, thought it was pointless. But even in that, you see this need he had to understand the why behind things. He couldn't just go through the motions, had to find meaning, make sense of it all.
Yeah, I get that. Makes me think of those kids who are constantly asking why. They're not just being difficult, they genuinely want to understand how things work. Jung just never really grew out of that phase.
Totally. And it wasn't all smooth sailing for him, especially later on. I mean, his break with Freud, that was a huge deal. We should probably unpack that a bit, as it really set the stage for Jung to come into his own. So for those who don't know, what went down there?
Well, at the heart of it, you've got two brilliant minds butting heads over some really fundamental ideas about psychology, about the human experience itself, really. And it basically boils down to Freud's emphasis on sexuality as this primary driving force in human behavior.
Which, don't get me wrong, Jung didn't totally discount. But he felt like Freud's model, with its focus on repressed desires and all that, was too narrow.
Too focused on one piece of the puzzle, maybe.
Exactly. It's like Freud was looking at the world through this one specific lens, and Jung was saying, hold on, there's a lot more going on here. He saw the unconscious as this wellspring of creativity, spiritual insight. It was a much more expansive, I guess you could say even optimistic view of human nature.
It was less about what was wrong with people and more about their potential for growth and transformation.
Right. And you see this difference in how they viewed things like religion, too. Freud saw it as this kind of neurosis, right? A crutch we lean on to cope with the fact that life is hard. But for Jung, there was this genuine human need to connect with something larger than ourselves.
So we have this split with Freud, which I think really pushed Jung to forge his own path. And instead of shying away from all this uncertainty, he leans into it. And it's in that space, this willingness to question and explore, that his own unique approach to therapy starts to emerge.
And it's a pretty radical departure from what was considered the norm at the time. Instead of the therapist directing everything, he starts to emphasize the importance of letting the patient's unconscious take the lead.
Really flipping the script, huh? It's like he's saying, hey, if we really want to understand what's going on, let's listen to what your unconscious mind has to say. Let's let that guide the conversation. It's brilliant, really, because if our unconscious minds are where we store all these memories, patterns, and even potential, doesn't it make sense to tap into that?
Right. It's like giving a voice to that part of ourselves we often ignore. And what's fascinating is how Jung discovered that by doing so, these incredibly powerful images and symbols would just emerge organically. And often, these led to really profound insights for his patients. Like, remember that story about the woman who unconsciously started moving like a shoemaker?
Oh, yeah. That one was wild. At first glance, you'd think, what does that have to do with anything? But then to find out it's connected to this past heartbreak involving a, you guessed it, shoemaker. It's like, whoa. Our bodies, they hold on to things even when our conscious minds have moved on.
Exactly. And that's what Jung was tapping into, these deep-seated patterns in the unconscious that can play out in our lives, often without us even realizing it. It's like he was saying, don't underestimate the power of the unconscious. It's always there, working behind the scenes, influencing our thoughts, our behaviors, even our physical movements.
Okay, so the question that becomes, how do we start to recognize those patterns in our own lives? What are some ways we can start tuning into those messages from the unconscious?
Well, Jung would say, start paying attention. Like really paying attention to those dreams, those recurring thoughts, those gut feelings you get. Write them down. See if you can spot any patterns, any themes that keep popping up.
So it's not about ignoring those weird dreams or brushing them off as nonsense. It's about treating them like clues, like they might actually mean something.
Exactly. And sometimes the meaning might not be obvious right away, but if you stay curious and keep digging, you might be surprised by what you uncover.
It's like having this whole other world bubbling away beneath the surface, sending up these little flares, trying to get our attention. And Jung would say, those signals, those dreams, those gut feelings, they're not random. They're trying to tell us something.
Oh, definitely. And if we try to ignore them, pretend they're not there, well, that's when things can get messy.
It's like sweeping dirt under the rug, right? It doesn't actually go away. It just kind of festers.
Exactly. And that's where Jung's whole concept of the shadow comes in. This is big stuff. Really gets to the core of his thinking. Basically, it's that part of ourselves we'd rather not acknowledge, all the stuff we try to hide, keep locked away, insecurities, fears, maybe even some anger or aggression lurking down there.
Yeah, it's not pretty. It's like that voice in the back of your head saying all the things you'd never actually say out loud. We all have it, right? To some degree.
We do. But Jung wasn't saying we should be afraid of it. In fact, he believed that trying to suppress our shadow, pretend it doesn't exist, that just gives it more power.
It's like that saying, what you resist persists.
100%. Jung believed that by acknowledging the shadow, even befriending it in a way, we could actually tap into a huge source of energy and creativity. It's about integrating those parts of ourselves we'd rather hide, not pretending they don't exist.
It's like turning those so-called negative traits into something positive, like harnessing that energy for good. But this idea of the shadow, it takes on this whole other level of meaning when you consider what was happening in the world during Jung's lifetime. I mean, this is a guy who lived through 2 world wars, saw the rise of these terrifying totalitarian regimes.
Oh, absolutely. It had a profound impact on his thinking. He saw the horrors of that era, the things humans are capable of, and he believed it was partly because on a collective level, we were unwilling to face our own capacity for evil.
So he's making this connection between our individual shadows and this kind of collective shadow that plays out on the world stage.
Exactly. And for Jung, those destructive ideologies like Nazism, they weren't just political movements, they were manifestations of the shadow run wild, but on this massive global scale.
That's a lot to process. It's almost like if we as individuals don't do the work to integrate our own shadows, we're contributing to this larger shadow that can manifest in some truly terrifying ways.
It's heavy stuff for sure.
Yeah.
But Jung never lost sight of the fact that we also have an incredible capacity for good. And that's where his concept of individuation becomes so important. It's this lifelong journey of becoming a whole, complete individual.
And it's not just about us, right? It's about recognizing our interconnectedness with, well, everything and everyone.
Right. It's both personal and collective. Like as we each work towards wholeness, as we face our shadows and strive to become more conscious, it creates a ripple effect that extends outwards. We make the world a better place just by working on ourselves.
So it's this beautiful paradox, this inward journey that actually has the power to change the world around us.
Exactly. And Jung believed that these individual acts of self-awareness, of compassion, of striving for something greater, they create this kind of collective uplift.
But let's be honest, this work, this individuation thing, it's not always sunshine and roses. It can be messy, uncomfortable, even scary at times.
No, it can be.
Yeah.
Because it requires us to really look at ourselves. And I mean, really look at all the good, the bad, the stuff we'd rather keep hidden. And that can be tough.
Which is probably why so many of us avoid it. It's easier to just stick with what we know, even if it's not working for us. But Jung wasn't afraid to go there. In fact, he seemed drawn to the unconventional, even the paranormal. It's not something you'd necessarily associate with a man of science.
Right. And some people thought he was a little out there because of it. But those experiences, the ones that defied easy explanation, they played a huge role in shaping his worldview.
Yeah, like that story he tells about his sister appearing to him in a dream after she passed away.
It's chilling, right? And he describes it so vividly, like it was more real than a dream. And it's interesting because it wasn't just a simple visitation. In the dream, he also sensed that another woman, someone he knew in waking life, was going to die.
And then she did.
She did, shortly afterwards. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? About the nature of time, of consciousness, the boundaries of what we think we know.
It's a lot to wrap your head around. How do you even begin to make sense of something like that?
Well, Jung didn't try to explain it away or dismiss it as just a weird dream. For him, it was a glimpse into a deeper reality, one where maybe time and space operate a little differently than we think. He was particularly fascinated by the idea of synchronicity, meaningful coincidence.
Oh, yeah, like when you're thinking about someone you haven't seen in years and then bam, they call you out of the blue.
Exactly. For most people, it's just a quirky coincidence. But Jung saw these synchronicities as evidence of this deeper interconnectedness, this realm beyond our usual understanding where our inner and outer worlds could intersect.
So it's about being open to the possibility that there's more to life, to reality, than we can currently explain.
Absolutely. And if dreams can give us a glimpse into that other realm, maybe they're even more important than we realize.
More than just random firings of neurons while we sleep.
Right. Jung saw dreams as this direct line to the unconscious, this language of symbols and metaphors that, once understood, could provide incredible insights.
It's like he's saying, pay attention to those dreams. They're trying to tell you something important.
And not just pay attention, but engage with them. Write them down. Reflect on them. See what they might be revealing about your waking life. They might hold the key to unlocking something really profound.
It's about treating them like messages from ourselves, to ourselves, which I think is a good segue to talk about Jung's own spiritual journey, because that wasn't exactly a straight line either, was it?
It's not at all. I mean, he talks about having this very strong faith in God as a child. But as he got older, that simple faith was challenged. You know, he was exposed to new ideas, different ways of thinking. Something I think a lot of people can relate to.
That moment you realize the world is a lot more complicated than you thought it was when you were a kid. So Did he just abandon religion altogether?
Not really. It was more like a transformation. Like he moved away from organized religion. He was very critical of the dogma and hypocrisy he saw there. But his exploration of the unconscious, his study of mythology, it led him to this much more expansive view of the divine.
Less about rules and rituals and more about this personal connection to something greater than himself.
Exactly. He came to see God, or the divine, or whatever you want to call it, not as this distant figure up in the clouds, but as this force that's woven into the fabric of everything, including ourselves.
So it's not that he lost his faith, it's like he found it in a whole new way.
Right. And that's what's so beautiful about Jung. He wasn't afraid to question, to doubt, to let go of old beliefs and embrace new understandings. And in doing so, he shows us that it's possible to live a life full of meaning and purpose, even if we don't have all the answers.
It's less about having blind faith and more about actively searching for meaning, right? Trusting that there's something bigger than ourselves out there, even if we don't always understand it.
Absolutely. And that kind of open-minded curiosity, that willingness to sit with the unknown, it's something you see throughout Jung's work. And I think it directly influenced how he approached therapy, too.
You're saying because he was willing to explore these less conventional aspects of his own experience, it allowed him to create a space for his patients to do the same.
Exactly. Imagine going to a therapist back then and saying, hey, I think I had a visit from my dead grandmother in a dream, or I keep seeing this weird symbol everywhere I go. With a lot of therapists, you might get some side-eye.
Right.
But Jung, he was different. He understood that these things, however strange or unexplainable they might seem, they held meaning for the individual.
He didn't just dismiss those experiences as nonsense or try to rationalize them away. He leaned in, listened with curiosity. And in doing so, he gave his patients permission to do the same, to explore those parts of themselves without judgment.
And I think that gets to the heart of what Jung was trying to do to help people become more whole. Because there's true wholeness, true individuation. It's not just about focusing on the parts of ourselves that are easy to understand or that fit neatly into some box. It's about embracing the full spectrum of human experience, even the messy, the confusing, the seemingly paradoxical.
It's like that quote, "The unexamined life is not worth living." Except in this case, it's more like the unexamined experience is not worth having. We rob ourselves of so much when we shy away from the things that challenge our worldview or make us uncomfortable.
Right. Because it's often in those moments of discomfort, what the experience is, that we have the biggest opportunities to learn and grow.
And maybe that's the point. Maybe it's not about figuring it all out or arriving at some perfect state of enlightenment. Maybe it's about continually striving, questioning, and expanding our understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
Exactly. It's a lifelong journey. And Jung, he gives us this incredible roadmap for navigating that journey, with all its twists and turns and unexpected detours. He reminds us that there's always something new to discover, both within ourselves and in the world around us.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of Carl Jung, what's the one thing you hope our listeners will take away from this conversation? What's the nugget of wisdom they can carry with them?
I think it's about learning to pay attention to those whispers from the unconscious, those dreams, those synchronicities, those gut feelings that something more is going on. Don't dismiss them as just random occurrences. They might be trying to tell you something important about yourself, about your path.
It's about trusting your own inner compass, that inner wisdom that often speaks to us in a language we don't always understand right away.
Exactly. Keep a dream journal. Write down those weird coincidences, those recurring themes that keep popping up in your life. The answers are often closer than we think, but we have to be willing to do the work, to listen to that inner voice and see where it might lead us.
It's about embracing the journey of self-discovery with all its messiness and uncertainty, because it's often in those moments of not knowing that we make the most profound discoveries. This deep dive has given you a taste of Jung's profound ideas. We encourage you to continue exploring his work and see what hidden depths you might uncover within yourself. Until next time, keep diving deep.